from SOAS, University of London, where they mainly focus on African and Oriental studies, but they are also expanding in various directions. And one of the things that they've got where there is a lot going on is their religion department, which I've sort of ended up in almost by accident, because my background is sociology and disability studies. But when I became interested in the stories of disabled Christians, I got pushed towards religion. So you end up where people are doing the work that works for you. So I don't know if the title is quite going to work for what I've put together, because I submitted the title and then went, oh, hang on, I have other things to say. So we'll see if it lives up to the title. But I wanted to talk a bit today about the neglect of religion in disability studies and the neglect of the whole topic of religions, and how that might be impacting on disabled people who go to churches, which is my particular area of interest. There is also lots of work to be done on disability in Islam, disability in Buddhism has been looked at a little bit, but there's lots of religions where the situation for disabled people needs to be looked at, but this is still in very early stages for a number of religions. So I wanted to start with the concept of cultural locations of disability, which is a concept that Snyder and Mitchell came up with. And Snyder and Mitchell talk about cultural locations for disability as places where people who are not disabled have control of ideas about disability. And they talk about them mainly as institutions. And they talk about the era of the institutions after the Industrial Revolution, where ideas about eugenics shaped these ideas about disability through these locations. So everything from so-called special schools through to daycare centres are kind of the inheritors of these places that controlled disability ideas, disability discourses. A major source of control of disability discourse, a major cultural location of disability in the UK has for many centuries been the Christian churches, which is a huge umbrella for many different institutions which have things in common, which is a general belief in the tenets of the Christian faith, but there are many types of churches out there. And they have for a long time controlled a lot of conversation around disability. And the thing that surprised me when I was starting to look at this was that they continue to have a lot of control over ideas about disability through various political ways, like the government working with churches, and through the fact that we are not in as secularised a society as we often think we are. But disability studies does not very much engage with these huge institutions that control discourses of disability in various ways. So I've got a slide here. Oh, hang on. Got a slide here, which is the website of the Church of England's Ministry Among Deaf and Disabled People, which has been through many changes of title over the years, which in the past was very much a ministry to disabled people. Now the talk that they are talking is about ministry of and with disabled people, but some of the sort of early stage research that's going on suggests that it's still very much the church does ministry to disabled people. It's not necessarily very interested in having disabled people be, for example, priests. For some individuals it's been possible, for others it's been a big fight. And so churches continue to control conversations about disability. And this relates to the global religious landscape, because we tell ourselves this story in the West which says that we are a secularised society and we assume that the world is secularised. But actually, first of all, Britain is atypical as a secularised society from other more secularised society. And secondly, the majority of the world is religious. So this graph, which is from 2010, the Pew Research Forum based in the States, says that just over 23% of the world's population is Muslim, just over 31% is Christian, 15% Hindus, and smaller percentages of other religions. Only 16.3% are unaffiliated, which includes atheists, but certainly isn't all atheists or secularists. So the way we do things in the West in regards to religion is really atypical compared to the rest of the world. And as disability studies starts to look at the rest of the world and talk about how we are the minority of the world and we are doing things in a particular way and yet controlling some of the resources and conversations around disability studies, we need to start looking at the number of people for whom disability includes an aspect of faith, because their life as a disabled person is also their life as a person of faith. And there has been a little bit of writing about people going into development projects and working with disabled people and being very surprised at how religious those disabled people were and finding it very alien because the disability movement and disability studies often talks about religion as somewhat the enemy. As the great oppressor that we must now move on from. But of course, if you then go to a country where people don't see it that way, it could be very contradictory to approach things that way. So I want to take a brief quote from Colin Barnes, who is an absolute hero of mine. He taught me on my MA, and I think he's wonderful. But he has been criticised in terms of the way he represents religion. Moss and Schipper are the people who are responding to him here. They are biblical studies in the States, and in the United States there is a little bit more being said about disability and religion than there is here, as you might expect in a slightly less secularised country. And there's some very interesting work going on in the field of biblical studies where people are reclaiming and retelling stories of disabled people from the Bible. So it's a really interesting little subfield. But they comment on the way that Colin Barnes represents religion. So in 2010, Barnes wrote, "In the Old Testament, much of Leviticus is devoted to reiteration of the physical and mental perfections deemed necessary for all aspects of religious ritual. Indeed, only lately have some people with learning difficulties been allowed to receive some sacraments in the Roman Catholic Church." All absolutely true. But Moss and Schipper criticise him and say that Barnes moves seamlessly from generations about Leviticus, which is an ancient text, a product of one ancient culture from far away and a long time ago, to nearly contemporary Roman Catholic practices thousands of years later, as though they share a common system of thought, which of course we wouldn't do with other systems of thought. We would understand that many thousands of years of thought would move in very different directions. And they go on to say that, for the record, Leviticus 21 never discusses mental imperfections or any type of cognitive impairment. So in fact, Colin Barnes' response to Leviticus is somewhat out of place, and perhaps he would find it more useful to look at more recent and more targeted sources for what the church certainly for the way that the church can be very oppressive towards people who are disabled, but the importance, Moss and Schipper argue, of understanding the discourse is really important, because critiquing a discourse without having any understanding of it will lead to the people behind that discourse not taking you very seriously. And in fact, that's what we see in a lot of theology, that disability studies is not taken very seriously and considered as irrelevant as disability studies finds religion. And so there's this enormous gulf between two discourses talking at odds to each other. So, just to summarise then, it's gone away. What did I do? Did I turn it off? Yes. Just to summarise then, some of what's been critiqued about the way that religions are ignored in disability studies includes a somewhat inexpert approach to religions, but also very different theoretical lenses used when the way that religion deals with disabled people is looked at. So, for example, there are people working in anthropology who look at healing ritual in a way that could be really, really interesting for disability studies, but they are using lenses that are different from that of people who are in disability studies. So they're looking at, for example, what it is that makes healing ritual effective for some people in a very psychological and individualistic way, and they're looking at processes of different group situations and what effect they can have on the mind and the body. But there's very little critique, for example, of power in healing rituals and how someone might be used as an object of power, and they may be used as an example of something without being a person within that. And then the lack of interdisciplinary interest in religions from disability studies generally is kind of exacerbating this. When you think about all the places that disability studies is going at the moment, literature, art, the media, so many places, the fact that it's not going as much into religion as it could is really quite interesting. There are people looking at the situation for disabled people in churches. There are quite a few, and they're coming from two different perspectives. So I want to say very briefly something about some people who are taking approaches that are very familiar to us in disability studies, the more liberationist disability theologians. John Hull was a blind theologian who died last year, who's written some amazing stuff that I wish was read by more people in disability studies, just for an understanding of the lives of people who are disabled and go to churches. And he talks about how disabled Christians' very existence, at least in the churches he's familiar with in the UK, can be a continual reminder of what some Christians would consider the imperfect nature of humanity, which they would consider will be rectified at the end of days. And he says that because of associations such as this, many disabled people have come to believe that, far from being a power for their emancipation, faith is a major source of their social and economic disadvantage. So he, with a much better understanding of the discourse, doesn't disagree with Colin Barnes or some of the criticisms that have come out of disability studies, but what he does is analyse what's going on in a lot more detail and say, here are some of the ways we might be able to talk back from our position as disabled Christians. It's very, very interesting. There are also people like Nancy Iceland who collected stories from her friends and colleagues who were disabled in the United States in the 90s, and came up with a really challenging and radical picture of a disabled God that many Christians did not like, but many disabled Christians absolutely loved. So there are some really interesting voices, but they are not, on the whole, particularly widely listened to within the Christian community. And on the whole, the people who have dominance over discourses of disability in the Christian community are those who want to care for them rather than empower them. So these were the kinds of situations I had in the background when I've been doing my research, which I'm now at the stage of analysing my interviews. This is a page from my blog, which was part of the way that I recruited disabled people who were members of churches. Social media was really important because there are very few networks of disabled Christians. There are no user-led networks at the moment, although some are beginning to coalesce. They are in some ways far behind the times of the secular disability movement. So I did unstructured interviews to acknowledge this difficulty with a lack of research that's been done so far and a lack of voices being heard. So try to allow disabled Christians to control the conversation so that I wasn't asking them about a particular area. And actually that's been really, really interesting because they've told me some things that I would not have expected to hear as someone with a Christian background but is not a Christian now. So their perspectives were very different from mine. I interviewed a whole range of people. I tried not to over-define the concept of disability, and in some cases I tried not to use it. So when I wanted to reach out to people with mental health problems because I was missing a group there, I didn't necessarily use the term disability, although they used it back to me in very interesting ways. So the framework is important to a lot of people. That doesn't cease to be important just because they're in churches. And I also, to make sure that I had talked to as many people in different impairment groups as possible, also went into some churches where people who I hadn't been able to interview were. So there are some very interesting church projects going on with people with learning difficulties, still at a stage where they're quite segregated, but addressing a need and hopefully empowering people to take things back to the mainstream churches. So I was really interested to look at those. So just a couple of my initial observations have been that church culture is a very big source of both inclusion and exclusion for people. Not so much the Christian faith itself, surprisingly, so much as the way that churches operate with certain hierarchies and certain ways of responding to people that are not necessarily central to Christian faith. So Georgina, who is autistic, talked about finding church a stabilising force in her life and not necessarily always wanting it to be, but coming back to it as a community that supported her in ways that perhaps her secular community didn't. But on the other side, Lucy, also autistic, with some moderate learning difficulties, found it very difficult in charismatic churches when, for example, they were dancing in ways that hadn't been explained to her what they were doing, and they were breaking social codes that she was familiar with. And of course that was very alienating to her as someone who doesn't process new social codes very well. And there are some very strong ideas coming out of the churches about how all the churches need is welcome. They need to open up the doors and welcome people in and have friendship, and that will change any past oppression that disabled people have experienced. And while that's a nice thought, the difficulty is that a number of my participants came back to me and said, well, what on earth is friendship and what on earth is welcome? And is this people who have a certain idea of friendship telling us what friendship should be? Anthony talked about, he's autistic and has learning difficulties as well. He talked about how his idea of friendship is very different from the ideas of friendship he had encountered in churches. And again, this idea of church culture, not necessarily anything central to Christianity, but rather to the way that churches as institutions operated. But something slightly closer to the central points of Christianity was healing theology, which people had a huge wide range of views on, and I was really interested to get into that, and I want to write some separate papers on it, because I think it's fascinating that the whole spectrum was represented through people who rejected any idea of healing and said, I am not a mistake, I am a child of God just as any non-disabled person is. They are imposing their own idea of what is normal, and that is not my idea of what is normal, and that's not God's idea of what is normal. But that went right the way through to people who talked about having hope for being healed and that being important to them. And again, I was quite resistant to that as a disabled person from the disability equality movement. I wanted to say, well, do you not want to be proud in who you are? But if that's something that is important to them, then those voices need to be talked about and those debates need to be had. I think the most important thing at this stage, where these things are not being talked about from disabled people's perspectives, is that their voices are shared, and their stories are shared, and then hopefully people will be able to be in a position soon, and I think the signs are there that this is beginning to happen, where they can get together and talk from different parts of the Christian spectrum to each other. I have been involved in a user-led disability conference in a church in central London that's been going on for just about 4 years now, which is probably the first user-led thing in the UK in Christianity. And it's been very exciting to see people from very different church backgrounds come together in small numbers, but with the beginnings of something there. And what's been really exciting about that is that they have had a very good understanding that people will have very different theologies and very different ideas about things like healing, or about the type of church that they want to go to and what kinds of practices they want to engage in. But there's a lot of respect towards each other, which you don't necessarily see in the rest of the inter-churches movement. So that could be very exciting for the churches, not just to empower disabled people, but for disabled people to speak back to churches in quite profound and positive ways. So I will leave it there, and you can let me know if you have any questions on that. I'm sorry that I'm a little bit nervous today, but hopefully I'll still be able to answer your questions. Thank you.